Great. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's particularly nice to be speaking to climate scientists, so a distinguished audience. My name's Edward. I'm heading up our climate policy unit in essentially the technical part of the European Investment Bank. And I basically want to use my 10 minutes now to, more than anything else, to relay our enthusiasm on our side about the collaboration we have now with ECMWF. In a nutshell, to help, be able to use the state-of-the-art data that's here to help inform the sort of investment decisions we're making into long-term infrastructure, to try to understand if they are well adapted to and will remain economically productive for decades ahead. That's principally the aim of the collaboration. There are other elements as well, which I may touch upon. First, let me just take a step back and perhaps explain what the European Investment Bank is, what we do. We are a public bank, so we're owned by the EU 27. Those are our shareholders, established under the Treaty of Rome, principally just to support the infrastructure needs associated with European Union policy goals. We operate globally, and we are investing around 60 billion a year, 60 billion euros a year globally in all kinds of, let's say, long-term infrastructure projects in the energy sector, in the transport sector, in the water sector, in the agri-space, etc. Clearly, climate is one of the absolute key EU priorities, policy priorities, and EIB has responded to that. We're effectively a climate bank. Half of what we lend per year is directed towards climate action projects, mitigation, adaptation projects. And one aspect that sets EIB apart a little bit from others is that we took a commitment a couple of years ago to ensure that all of the financing that we're providing, all of the assets that we're creating, are aligned to the goals of the Paris Agreement. So that's led to a lot of work around understanding that the projects we're supporting are consistent with a low-carbon future. I'm not going to be talking about that today, but in a nutshell, we're not financing a lot of heavy carbon-intensive products, processes at all. So it's just not eligible for us. But we're also focusing on that second dimension of the Paris Agreement around resilience and adaptation. So again, ensuring that the assets that we're creating, or trying to understand, to a climate scientist audience, I'm not going to overstate, we're trying to understand the risks that the assets that we're creating are likely to be exposed to, and try to understand the extent to which those risks can be mitigated through the design, through various operational measures, etc. So that's the second dimension that I'm stressing, and hence what we've done is we've tried to incorporate that type of thinking and analysis into the routine due diligence we're doing across all of our projects. And then we need a tool, and then that tool needs really, really good data behind it, and hence you get I've joined the dots with the collaboration with ECMWF. Good. Let me perhaps, if I can find, now I've lost it. Thank you very much. I would like to just slightly generalize the presentation and just say a few words about the state of play in the finance industry as a whole. I think the good news, in a sense, I've been involved in financing infrastructure now for 20-odd years. 10 years ago, very little appreciation, understanding, perhaps with some sectors like ports, but in general, very little appreciation from project designers, project promoters, financiers, about thinking through future climate change and what that might mean for the design of projects. The good news is, I think that's fundamentally changed. So the project designers, the project promoters that we're talking to, conceptually, everybody gets it. Everybody understands that financiers are coming and posing questions around, okay, fine, how does this piece of infrastructure, please convince me that this piece of infrastructure is designed adequately for future climate change scenarios. The other good bit of news is, really a quantum change in the regulatory environment, particularly around financiers, meaning that if you're a bank in the European Union, you're subject to supervision if you're above a certain size from the European Central Bank. 2 years ago, the European Central Bank published its supervisory guidance around climate and environmental risks. And in a nutshell, that says, dear bank, you need to be able to explain how the extent to which your balance sheet is exposed to risks either from transition to low carbon or from physical climate change risks. So that guidance went out 2 years ago, and it's essentially it's ratcheting up now over time. I'm not going to talk through all the details, but the EU regulatory environment, including the so-called taxonomy, is now very explicit on these type of requirements. So again, conceptually, there's a huge change. The real issue is, of course, and I'm talking to this audience, so I don't need to explain it, the real issue is how do you translate that into tools? And particularly, how do you cut through all of the complexity into the sort of tools that can help manageably quantify this type of risk and boil it down into decisions. When we go to our board, we finance a project or we don't. So at what point is a project adapted to future climate change? And at what point is it not? I'm exaggerating the point almost to make it, there's so much complexity out there, and we really need tools to boil these things down in ways that are operational. Okay, so the good news is that there's a good understanding. The bad news, this is some recent work published by the European Central Bank. So they've been looking at all the responses from all of the banks that they've been saying, okay, we have this supervisory guidance, please explain to us how you're putting this into practice, and then they've assessed the results. And if I can push the right button, okay, down here, essentially, the main message here is half of the banks in Europe essentially either have inadequate kind of ways to assess climate change risks, and or they're just not explaining, they're not transparent about how they're doing this. So that's the bad news. I suppose we can try to be optimistic. That's 4 data points from, I think, 109 odd sample size, of banks which are both adequate and transparent. But I would stress the point that the overwhelming majority of banks are finding their way on this at the start of a journey. Okay. I need to accelerate. What are we doing at EIB? So at EIB, we've tried to essentially take on some leadership in this area and get tools in place. I will not go through this in the time available, but essentially at a high level, it's a due diligence process, so it's process-based, and essentially says, when we begin to see projects, we do an immediate, quick and dirty screening, depending on the sector, depending on the region of the world. Are they likely to be, is it likely to be exposed to climate-sensitive variables or not? If the answer is yes, then we go into a deeper dive during the due diligence process, and we begin to discuss it with the promoter, and we begin to try to understand the extent to which the project is appropriately designed, etc. Key point, clearly that type of process needs to be based on at least the state-of-the-art data. So that's absolutely the crucial point for us. Does it matter? Again, to this audience, I think this is an easy one, but to illustrate the point, this is one example. We could have picked many. This is a project we financed in Fiji to improve water supply. And when we first looked at the project, essentially the intake of water was being taken from very close to the coastline. Once it went through a proper climate risk and vulnerability assessment, it was very clear that it was exposed to a high risk of salinity intrusion, and hence, essentially, the project design was changed to bring the water supply further inland. Small additional cost, and it's a good example of how now, hopefully, that project is, fit for purpose, to use the language, for the next decades. I'm not going to say I'm running out of time, so I would just put the only point I want to make with this slide is this piece of data, this piece of tool, or this tool rather, is in the context of a number of our activities to support adaptation. What I'd stress is that we are, EIB is in the process now of, we're talking fairly constantly with promoters and with other financial partners. We have technical assistance. Sorry, I've gone in the wrong direction. We have technical assistance and advisory to work with others, and hence this tool is not just for EIB, it's for our partners as well. Let me conclude in time. What I've tried to argue is there's a much better understanding, I think, now in the investment community about the importance of having robust climate data to projections to see that the assets that we're financing are fit for purpose for the decades ahead. That said, it's about tools, it's about turning this into operation. We're still at an early stage. We are investing in this as an institution, and the partnership with ECMWF is crucial to that. Let me stop. Thank you.
Questions for Edward? I'll make a tough decision by prioritizing someone who hasn't spoken yet. Is that all right? Okay, so we need a microphone. It's a pink scarf, you can't miss it.
Yeah, I know, but I have to get there. Hello, thanks a lot for the nice presentation. It's a kind of new world for me. So I'm Jennifer Lehner from Deutscher Wetterdienst, DWD, and I'm just interested if you have a small example. So how is it concrete? How is the C3S data, for instance, making other decisions than you would have done without the data? So do you have a project you could just give us a small example, or?
Well, I think the Fiji one is the most, it's a very concrete one, but the generic point I'd make is that now what we're often doing is when early on in the due diligence process, if we're seeing this vulnerability, is we're working with the promoter to go through a formal, climate risk vulnerability assessment. So I think the bigger point is really around the embedding that into the general process, and that obviously coming out of that is potentially design changes, operational changes, etc.
Okay, thank you.
Fantastic. In the interest of time, and of course you'll have space on the panel to ask questions to Edward, I'd like to move on to the next speaker. Thanks a lot, Ed.